Robby Müller captures perfectly the light and color of a Northern European city in winter. You can almost feel the damp and cold in your bones. Those are words from director and member of Jesus and Mary chain, Douglas Hurt. Seeing Faces in Movies is a podcast where each month I focus on the works of a different director or a cinematographer, and each week I invite a guest on to discuss the film and the artist's filmography. I'm your host, Felicia, and today we're talking about The American Friend. This is the first time we're doing a cinematographer in focus, so although these films are directed by different people, we're talking about them through the lens of Robby Müller's cinematography. So quick synopsis of the film. Tom Ripley, who deals in forged art, suggests a picture framer he knows would make a good hitman. The film stars Dennis Hopper as Tom Ripley, Bruno Ganz as Jonathan Zimmerman, Lisa Kreuzer as Marianne Zimmerman, and Gérard Blain as Raoul Minot. It's written by Wim Wenders, based on the novel by Patricia Highsmith, cinematography by Robby Müller, edited by Peter Pisgata, and music by Jürgen Nieper. So today my guest is Peter Merriman. Peter and I have known each other for a good 10 years now at this point. You know, we've seen quite a few films together, and we've actually seen this film together in the cinema. And I just really respect his enthusiasm about the films that he loves and the filmmakers he loves. So I'm very excited to have him on. So thank you so much, Peter, for joining the show today.
Thanks for having me on. It's an honor to be on this podcast.
I'd love for you to tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and what your relationship is to cinema and specifically the films that Robby Müller has worked on.
I guess I'm sort of an amateur film enthusiast. I liked films growing up, and then I think started maybe thinking about them more seriously as an adult, but still in a very amateurish way. But I think I've been lucky to be friends with or know a lot of people who have more professional or academic relationships with film, where they're critics or filmmakers or writers or studied film studies like yourself. And so I've, like, a lot of other stuff in my life, I've just learned a lot from the people I've been around. Yeah, like you said, we've seen some films and this film together.
What about with Müller's work himself? Do you recall when you started noticing his style of work and the first films of his you've seen?
So I think something good about him. I should start off by saying I know very little about him.
Mm-hmm. It's okay.
But that something I like about him going over his discography is that his work seems to be in service of the director. And so when you read about him, people say, okay, he uses natural light, this or that. But I think that his style, like this film, The American Friend, and Breaking the Waves, you wouldn't necessarily think that they're shot by the same person. I don't think.
No, I agree.
Or his work with Jarmusch even.
I think he's got like certain stylistic choices, but like you said, he's very much in service of the director. You never feel like, oh, this is a Robby Müller film. It's more so he's always trying to work with the story itself. He's never trying to overpower. It's just that his photography is so beautiful. That's why you notice it.
It is, but in different ways, which I like.
Yeah.
I think Deakins is a bit like that sometimes because he's worked so much with the Coens. You think of one way, but his other stuff either is more commercial stuff or some other stuff he's done is different, I think, for better and worse. To me, this is beautiful film that's not so beautiful that it distracts from the story. The sort of form seems to suit the content well. I think this film was really well done.
I agree. So, good choice.
Oh, thank you. I don't know if the listener needs to know this, but I, and then you chickened out of doing Breaking the Waves.
Yes, very much. To be honest, I was totally grateful. I mean, as much as it's one of the few Von Trier that I think I could rewatch, but it's not one that you're excited to rewatch.
Do you watch the other two, the TV show?
No. With
Drew Tarver? His character plays an actor in it, and he's on a phone with an agent he's impersonating someone, but he's trying to get a role for someone. And he said, oh yeah, he loves these roles with a lot of trom in them. Like for trauma.
Oh God.
Think of Breaking the Waves as a trom movie now, I bet.
Yes. I've said in past episodes that typically I give the guest it's their choice of film, but I do have to put my foot down for some of them. And for when it came to Mueller, I was like, I am not doing Dancer in the Dark. Like, I cannot rewatch that. I would rather watch The American Friend any day.
I think I find Breaking the Waves harder to watch than Dancer in the Dark for some reason.
Oh, yeah?
Although Dancer in the Dark, I'm almost never late for movies, and I got to Dancer in the Dark right at the beginning, and I was like, okay, I'll find my seat like as soon as, the brightness of the image starts. And it starts with a blacked out screen for like the first 2 minutes or something as foreshadowing, I guess. Not the best film to find a seat in a theater at the beginning of.
No. Let's get into the tagline for this film. It's very straightforward. So the tagline for The American Friend is transforms Patricia Highsmith's Ripley's game into a gripping European noir. So I think this tagline, it's specifically for a poster. So it's probably The American Friend transforms. It's not very showy. Some of the other taglines I've read for other films are much more interesting. This is just factual. So a few facts about the film. Dennis Hopper and Bruno Ganz did not initially get along, and they actually got into a fist fight on set. But after a night of drinking, the two returned to the set with their differences settled. They have great chemistry in this film, I find.
Absolutely.
They're acting, so who knows? But I feel like they seem like they had been friends for a long time. So it's interesting to read that they actually kind of hate each other at the beginning. Sometimes that bonds the best type of friendships.
It sort of mirrors the relationship in the film, where there's sort of conflict and sliding and social awkwardness at first, and then quite a meaningful, palpable bond between the two.
Another fact is when Wenders went to go pick up Hopper at the airport, he had super long hair, was unshaven, and was dressed in military gear because Hopper had directly flown from the Apocalypse Now set and didn't even bother to change. Wenders was a little shocked when he saw him because that didn't, correspond to the character that he had in mind.
Hopper's an interesting choice for Ripley. I don't think he's an obvious one, but he's so good in this movie.
That ties into another fact because Wenders actually wanted Cassavetes for the role. When Cassavetes turned it down, he actually suggested Hopper for this role. It's funny when you watch it at first, especially if you've seen other Ripley films, and this is maybe the third one you're seeing, or it's a little off-putting the way he plays him because it's not, he's not the Alain Delon, the Matt Damon style. And because he's Dennis Hopper, he's a little creepy. So you're kind of like, oh, this is a choice, but it works.
He has when I think of Ripley, and I haven't read the books, but I have seen those films you mentioned, and the Malkovich version of this story, Ripley's Game. He has the charisma, I think, that's so important to Ripley. And also the insecurity that I think is important to Ripley that Matt Damon does pretty well. I think, too, that there's sort of this two sides of a coin of sort of the bravado and the insecurity. It takes a while to settle in, but Hopper's so good at that in this film.
Oh, yeah. It does definitely take a little while, but once it does, you get into it because when you first see him, you're trying to understand what he's doing, to be honest. And then once you get kind of those monologues from him, whether he's talking to himself or he's talking to Zimmerman, then you kind of understand, okay, this is who he is, and this is what his deal is. I'll never say no to a Dennis Hopper inclusion in a film.
I feel like maybe I haven't seen him in that many films, and I certainly hadn't seen him recently, and I was just, this is not an original statement or anything, but he's so good in this. Like, he's just such a good actor, really. It's such a great performance to have these sort of two sides of bravado and sort of this, I guess, chutzpah in a way, and then the insecurity and being kind of pricked by these social slights, perhaps out of his already feeling uncomfortable in certain societies and certain classes, being an imposter.
Very much. And we'll get into a bit more of Hopper as well, because I definitely, despite the fact that's a performance section, but I think that it's really important to talk about what he did. If you want to talk about a couple more actors in this film, there's actually 8 movie directors that are cast in this film.
I can only think of 2.
So I knew of 3 of them, Or I guess technically 4, because Hopper is also director.
Mm-hmm.
But the other ones are ones that I didn't personally know of beforehand. So this is just through research. So the 8 are Dennis Hopper, Samuel Fuller, Nicholas Ray, and Jean Eustache. Did you know Jean Eustache was in it?
No, I don't know who that is. What has he directed?
I think his biggest one is The Mother and the Whore.
Okay, haven't seen it.
And then Gérard Blain, who plays the Frenchman who sets the whole deal up. He's also a director. And then the other 3 are Rudolf Schundler, Peter Lithenthal, and then Daniel Schmidt. So they're probably lesser known. They're more European directors. They're lesser known, but Wenders was good friends with them. And they'd been actors as well. So he cast them all in criminal roles. But outside of Hopper, the 2 big ones that you see are Fuller and Nicholas Ray. And I want to save the Nicholas Ray talk for once we get into the film, because I'm sure we both have a lot to say about Nicholas Ray. Just another last quick fact was that the gun that Bruno Ganz carries in the train station scene was actually a real gun because they couldn't afford a fake gun for the film. So I'd like to get into just the film itself and, the story and Müller's work on it. So one of the first points I wanted to discuss was the rewatchability of the film. So we've both seen this now more than once, and I don't know how you felt about it the first time you watched this film, but I remember being kind of confused, right? There's a lot going on, and Wenders purposely didn't include parts of the story because he was leaving it up to the audience to fill the gap. And I remember not being as taken with the film, remembering the visual aspects of it and it being gorgeous to look at and the performances, but the story itself didn't take with me. But then rewatching it for this, I loved this movie because I was able to focus on stuff as opposed to being like, what's happening?
Trying to work out plot.
Exactly. So for you who's seen it also more than once, how do you feel about rewatching? Is this something that you find that's rewatchable, or did you kind of get it in the first watch, or how does it hold up to multiple watches?
Yeah, I think I was able to watch it okay in the first watch. I generally knew the plot. It doesn't follow it exactly, but I had seen Ripley's Game a while ago. But yes, I agree with you on the rewatchability. I think I like rewatching films anyway. Sometimes you're just trying to keep up with the plot the first watch, or you're blown away by this one performance the first time. But I love being able to rewatch films. And this time, obviously, we were both paying maybe more attention to the cinematography, but also just noticing the soundtrack a bit more, noticing the score more this time, I think, for me. The acting, I think I was able to appreciate a bit more this time. And the plot mechanics, I guess, the way that it's formatted, I guess you could say it's an art director making a genre film, or a very artfully made genre film, almost meta given the casting and stuff. And he's sort of putting his money where his mouth is, where he's saying, I want to make this film, and I appreciate these people who also make artful melodramas, westerns, noir films. And it's got that sort of Cinémathèque, or what I think of as Cinémathèque or Cahiers top 10 appreciation of American film in it, an American genre film in particular in it, that I really admire. I think the film's dedicated to one of the co-founders of the Cinémathèque. But I remember thinking, this would for sure be in Cahiers top 10, because they put, Ray and Fuller in that. But they apparently, I don't know if this is an editorial issue or what, but they didn't do those lists during the 70s. They stopped in the late 60s and then started again in either late 70s, early 80s, I think. So the film, I'm sure it was well reviewed, or I imagine it was well reviewed, but there wasn't a top 10 list the year that this came out.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. I mean, this was his kind of breakthrough in terms of Wenders and Müller, his breakthrough into American, audiences. So whether people liked it or not, it seems to have, struck a note of some sort. There is a point that you mentioned earlier about the city, because this takes place in different cities. And sometimes it's hard to kind of differentiate which city they're in. You have to kind of follow the story very closely. But what you said was that the city never, or the imagery of the cities never overpowers the story. And I totally agree, because the way he shoots the city backdrop is just kind of the way you would view the city you're living in. It's not to marvel at it. It's more so to be like, this is the setting they're in. And sometimes it looks ugly. Sometimes it looks beautiful. There are shots of the cities that they're in. Things don't look great because that's just factual. And sometimes it looks beautiful because those are factual. So in terms of the way he shoots cities, and sometimes they're not distinctive, how do you feel about the way they move through the cities and the way they're shot? Because I think it is an important part of the story and the visuals, despite the fact that it's not the star. It's not like those cities are the characters on themselves like they might be in other films.
Yeah, the cities are great. A thought that popped into my head is the way he shoots Paris almost reminded me of Trouble Every Day, a film that you've done on this podcast before. I think this film's Paris is a little bit recognizable in Trouble Every Day. And as far as the German cities, I this is terrible, but I forget the name of the city that it's in northern Germany.
Yeah, I think they're in Hamburg.
Hamburg, and then they go down to the south kind of for one of the second job, I think. But yeah, it's a mix of kind of the frame shop looks so nice.
Yeah.
And the way that the auction is shot is really, this is getting more into cinematography, I guess, is so interesting to me because it's this sort of bright light that you don't really see in the rest of the film. So much of this film either actually takes place at night or looks like it takes place at night because it's in a dingy frame shop, even though it's taking place during the day. And the auction to me almost had a documentary feel to it because the light was so bright that it almost had the effect of making it look like digital film, even though this was being shot in the 70s to me. But yeah, the cities were really interesting to me. And I agree with you that they were a combination of dingy and beautiful. And I think that those are sort of themes in this film. And the way that they move in the city is almost like, I don't know if you ever see a rat in the film or anything.
Yeah.
But I was kind of thinking of kind of like feeling their presence off screen in a way. And the Ripley's house in this sort of abandoned mansion that looks like a section of the White House, I guess is like representing his nationality or whatever, feels like there would be rats all over the place. And he's kind of moving around like a rat a bit, Dennis Hopper, and he's getting Bruno Ganz to go down and sort of not the gutter, but the sunken area at the side of the house. Maybe this could tie to moving the discussion towards color in the film, which is something else. I'd be curious what your thoughts on that are.
For me, and you've mentioned this also, it's kind of like a noir. It's, I don't know if we want to use the term neo-noir, if we're just going to use noir. It's a noir that's in color. You got the grittiness of a noir, and you've got the thematic elements of a noir. And I think, like you said, there's kind of a seediness to the coloring. Sure. And sometimes it's aggressive and it's harsh, the lighting. And with one of the Müller tropes is kind of the neon lighting. So you see it in like restaurants on the streets. You see it in the subway lighting. The underground subway lighting is harsh. And then even one of my favorite scenes, and it comes up a couple times, where Ripley plays pool. There's the Canada Dry sign and that neon light coming down.
Absolutely.
It's beautiful, but it's also ugly and it's harsh. And it ties into those noir elements that are like, noir films are supposed to be kind of ugly and gritty, despite the fact that they are also beautiful with those shadows. So thematically, it's a noir. Visually, it's a noir. I'm just going to read a quick quote from Roger Ebert.
Please.
When he talks about the colors of this film.
Oh, great.
So he said, and the look of the film is hypnotic. The brashness and deepness of the colors, the exaggeration of lighting and setting, the extraordinary subtlety of some of the scenes, and the aggressive, cheap, and garish look of others. So it's just a little snippet of him talking about how the film moves from city to city and the coloring that's used there. But because Müller uses natural lighting, he's just taking those elements out of the cities without trying to make them uglier than they are. It's just showing how cities are lived in, right? So the colors of their surroundings. So how do you feel about the use of natural light in this and the colors coming through to represent different areas of the city, different people in the film?
Yeah, I think it's brilliant. And there's so many aspects to it, I think, that you could talk about. one of the things was I just, as a sort of layperson, I was like, how is he doing this? Because, you see these films, he seems to do both this natural light and the sort of garish neon. But sometimes he almost does them in the same shot, where this isn't necessarily neon light, but there are shots in the back room of the frame shop where there's like this Vermeer-ish natural light coming in from the front left of the screen. And then there's artificial lights. So it's like, it's beautiful and interesting, I guess. And this is sort of like a grade 9 essay thesis type of observation. But I think in so many ways, I mean, the main characters maybe being the obvious ones, but that it's a film of contrasts and sort of these, if not outright opposites, very different things. The extrovert, the introvert, the American, the German, all of these things. And I think that that's echoed in Müller's cinematography, and the natural light and the artificial light in the same shot, I think, is so interesting. Also, within the night shots, Canada Dry is a good example of this. There are these contrasting colors. Sometimes, I mean, in the case of Canada Dry, actual opposites with the red and the green. And there's often hot and cold colors, which both tend to be, I would say, oversaturated. I don't know what the film processing techniques that Müller uses are, or whether they tried to kind of punch them up, or whether he's capturing them naturally. But it reminded me of some of Christopher Doyle's kind of Wong Kar-wai collaborations, where there's red and green on screen, and there's blue and yellow, and there's orange and blue, where there's these hot and cold colors in opposite, really kind of pushing up against each other, creating this tension, like Hopper and Gantz in the film. And I think he does that so well without it ever becoming what I would call coffee table cinematography, where it's kind of decorative or beautiful for beauty's sake. Like I said earlier on, I think that these contrasts are thematically relevant and are a source of visual interest, but don't distract from the film rather than distracting. Like they add to the depth of the film, and they aren't beauty or ugliness.
Yes. And that's something through my research of him and spending this month diving into his work, he's always very, adamant about being like, I never want my imagery to be the star. I'm photographing and I'm being told what to photograph. The way I do it might be a certain way, but it's not supposed to be kind of like your Instagram picture perfect style movie. It's just that we view it so beautifully, but that was not his goal. And I think he does it well because, like you said, some of his films are more visually striking than others, but then something like Breaking the Waves, yes, the landscapes are beautiful, but I'm so focused on everything else that the cinematography doesn't necessarily stick out as much because it's doing so well to the story.
The cinematography is maybe giving you front row seats or better access to other things that in turn distract you from the cinematography. So the effectiveness is maybe more subliminal in Breaking the Waves.
I think that's a perfect way to capture what he does. And just a quote from himself in terms of that, he says, "The magic of the film image depends upon the viewer believing in the reality of the light." When we were talking about the neon and the harshness there, because I think, especially now with the way cinema is, and we know that everything's kind of color corrected in post, or it's like it's artificial lighting. What his goal is just to be like, this is real lighting that's achievable, and you just have to believe in that being a fact on screen.
Yeah, and there should probably be credits, I guess, to the director or the set designers. Or prop masters too, because they're finding these things to put together that will have this tension color-wise. I think there was a yellow raincoat, maybe Bruno Gantz's child wears at one point too, and there's this sort of dreary German cityscape, and this coat sticks out. It's almost like the red coat in
Don't look
Rogue.
Now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any child in a raincoat is always gonna
in the shadow of Rogue.
One other point that I want to talk about, because it's actually interesting that you mentioned, set design and people who, are the location scouts and all that, because that ties together so well. And that's another reason, as a side note, why I want to do, because most of the podcasts focus on directors and sometimes I do cinematographers. Eventually I might move into other things because I just think it's so important to credit everyone involved. To move on from that, the framing of a lot of shots is beautiful to me. And the one that sticks out that I do want to mention, and I'll ask you what some of your favorite shots are, but there's one in the frame shop where Zimmerman holds up like a broken frame to himself.
Yeah. Or is it when he's making it? Is it after he breaks the frame, or is it when he has the two sides and he's trying to fit the angle?
Yeah, when he has the two sides and you see him in the middle. That stuck out to me, especially in this watch. And I love the framing of that. And there's another scene also. I believe it's just after he shot the first man in the subway and he gets outside and he escapes outside and the camera is on top, is looking over, and it kind of drifts over to his side. And it just is just so beautiful. And it's one of those few moments that you're kind of outside of them.
And both of those are in absolute service of the moment in the film, the character, the relationships between the character, where there are all these, he shoots the guy in the last shot that you're talking about. There are all these tight shots of the surveillance cameras on the subway. It's so good the way that, I don't know how they did this. And it's all, at the time, it's probably all closed circuit television or something. And the camera's sort of panning. It's almost comical the way the camera's panning from left to right across these surveillance cameras. And he's just going on everyone, looking like a complete maniac who's just shot someone, the exact opposite of what he's been instructed to do. But then when he gets out of the station, there's this sense of like relief from the claustrophobia, and the camera pans out. And similarly, in that other great shot, it's like he's puzzling over the frame in a way and trying to get this just right. But it's early on in his relationship with Dennis Hopper, and he doesn't know what to make of him, I don't think. He feels this sort of simultaneous attraction and repulsion from this character. I think he's presented as sort of this very meticulous, logical sort of German craftsman. And I think at that moment in the film that the angles don't really make sense to him, that things are not aligning for him in his mind. And he's a bit confused about this while he's holding the frame like that. Yeah, it's so good, I think.
It's one of those films where I think just everything comes together so effortlessly. Another shot I do want to talk about, your final sequence on the beach. And as you said, most of this is in the darkness, or it's at least inside and it looks dark. We're not getting too many day shots. This one, it's kind of like harsh the way it flips. All of a sudden it's daytime, but it's just so beautiful.
Sunrise.
In the wide shot on the beach. Yeah, it's just gorgeous. So how do you feel about how that works for the story? Because it's kind of an ending to certain people, an ending to relationships, ending to lives, but a new beginning for others. So how that works visually.
Yeah, I think it works perfectly as a resolution. And if we're talking in terms of light, it's like if a noir takes place at night, then maybe the end of the story is dawn or sunrise. And visually, of course, it's beautiful, but thematically, I think it's kind of like this new beginning for these people, for his wife, for their child, for Ripley, I think, in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah, that seems so interesting. I guess that's how I would feel about it in terms of a form and function discussion of the cinematography. Plot-wise, I think it's also so interesting because there's, at least on my part as a viewer, there's this confusion the whole time of how sick is he? They're kind of gaslighting him this whole time, you think, about the severity of his diagnosis. Is blood disease? Is it cancer? What is it? Are the tests good or bad? Is his doctor okay? Or are the other things? I mean, they show them forging documents or stealing documents at one point. So, he's being misled, but it's unclear. And then when he just straight up dies at the end, you're given just a bit of warning, maybe like 30 seconds, and you're like, shit, this is really going to happen. And
I love that scene because, like you said, there is a bit of warning, a bit of leeway where he's driving and he's kind of manic. His wife is like, what the fuck are you doing? You need to slow down. I think we're good. We don't need to be driving like this. And then you realize it clicks for you. You're like, oh, yeah, he's not going to make it past this.
You're just waiting for him to roll the beetle.
Yep, which he's driving like a maniac. No, it's a great scene. And oddly enough, that's not the actual final scene. So the final scene is we go back to the beginning, essentially, with Nicholas Ray. So I think this is a good time to bring him up quickly. I know it's not super relevant to Müller, but it would be amiss to not discuss Nicholas Ray and just how cool he looks. How great that you don't really have any info other than he's an artist who's pretending to be dead. He's selling his paintings, Ripley's selling them, and he's making more money because he's dead. He's obviously worth more. The film opens up with Nicholas Ray. The film ends with him.
He might actually be a forger. I'm not sure. Maybe this will require some fact checking. I was reading about the books, and I think that the real artist commits suicide at some point. And in the credits, they put quotes around the name. So I'm not sure if Wenders changed it so that he's supposed to be the actual artist, but I think in the books he is a forger.
Okay. I haven't read the book. I didn't have time to do that.
I haven't either.
That is interesting. And I did wonder why there was the quotes around the name. And, I did kind of read something about that in my research, but I think it's purposely unclear.
I don't think this is covered in any of the films, but I think there was something about the real artist who was maybe involved with Ripley at some point, killing himself in Greece, and then the estate of the artist, I think maybe here represented by the auctioneer who introduces Gantz and Hopper, is in cahoots with Ripley to sell pieces that they know aren't authentic on the market.
That makes sense. That's another layer to the story there.
It's interesting. But yeah, I don't know about that last scene and it not ending on the beach or the highway. Yeah, I wonder about it. I mean, Ripley walking off into the distance sort of makes sense. It's almost like a Western ending, I guess, which makes sense with Ray in a way.
It is weird that it goes back to him. And I didn't remember that from my initial watch, that it went back. I thought it ended just with them on the beach, which would have been a more than acceptable ending. So it is interesting why they cut him back into the film with him just kind of walking away.
Yeah, maybe Wenders felt that image was strong. I think it was used on some of the posters because there are a couple. When you were talking earlier about shots that you loved and this sort of perfect framing, and you mentioned the wide shot coming out of the station and him working on the frame for Hopper, one of the ones I thought you were going to say is earlier in the film, or at least not at the very end, when I think he's talking to Ray and they're just almost reciting poetry or these nonsense lines. And he gets up and he just starts walking away on the edge of the overpass. This sort of very high, I was like, he's clearly actually doing this and this looks very dangerous. Yeah. And the camera pans up just high enough to get like a little bit of sky in between the tallest building and the top of the frame. And I thought, this is such a nice image. And I don't know if maybe that image held some sway over Wenders or Müller, where they decided to repeat it at the end of the film.
Maybe. There's got to be some sort of significance for it. But I wonder if it's just something that is supposed to be just left up to the audience, or if on another watch you understand it more. I'm not mad about it.
Yeah, maybe just the sense that he's always traveling or that he's got more distance to go. The road and the highway, I guess, is an image and theme that's very important to Wenders before and after this film. Traveling, I guess, King of the Road was before this. Is that right? And what's the trilogy?
The trilogy is all before, and then it continues on. Obviously your big one, Paris, Texas, and so on. So he is very much interested in the traveler along with the act of traveling. So maybe that was that, just kind of inserting his thing into the end
his
there.
Stamp.
It's cool having the different directors. I do find that for me, and this is just a me thing from the first time watching it, I didn't realize which one was Samuel Fuller and which one was Nicholas Ray because they kind of look alike towards that part of their career.
Ray wears the eye patch a bit, which kind of tips you off if you're familiar with his biography, sort of post most of his most well-known films. But yeah, they do look alike. I like Fuller's performance a bit more, maybe.
Yeah.
He doesn't seem like a good actor, but he's like really giving it his kind of like psycho gangster best, which kind of works with his films, I think.
It's always interesting to see a director put on a performance, whether it's big or small. Yeah. Some are better than others. Definitely. Some are actually good actors, you know, like your Dennis Hopper, although he started off as an actor. So do you have that advantage? But I just always find it interesting, especially if you recognize the directors. And there's some people who watch these films who probably don't know any of these people. You know, they're just watching and they've never heard of, you know, Nicholas Ray, Samuel Fuller.
Or maybe they've seen Rebel Without a Cause and they don't realize the connection. Or even, I don't know, Johnny Guitar or Bigger Than Life, I guess, is on Criterion too.
Those are interesting performances. I guess we did talk a little bit about Hopper, his performance. Gans, I love his performance in this.
It's so good.
I love his look in it.
His look is so good.
There's a quietness to his performance. You can tell that he's the star of the film. Him and Hopper, obviously, are the stars. And the way they work together, I know we kind of talked about it, but they work so well. And they just, it's weird because it kind of becomes like a buddy movie at some point. With them traveling along. And you never get that vibe at the beginning, but once it gets there, it's fun watching them. It's stressful. But the scene on the train when Hopper...
When he slaps the guy unconscious.
I love that scene too. Just that whole them working together and the stressed look on Gans' face because he's like, I wasn't expecting to see you here, and the way they work together. There is one quick thing I did want to mention. I can't remember if it's in that scene on the subway or the train or if it's before, but at some point, because Hopper's wearing or Ripley, I should say, is wearing a cowboy hat the whole time. And he takes off his hat at some point and just reveals one of the worst haircuts I've ever seen in my entire life.
Maybe ahead of its time.
Yeah, maybe. I was like, I don't know if this is hat hair or it's just used.
He's got like a good medium length too.
Yeah.
Like they went simple with it, but it's clean cut. It's not it's hard to imagine Ripley having hair that long, but.
Oh yeah, no. Especially because Hopper is a good-looking enough guy, but he's not. You know, he's not Anna Deno and he's not Matt Damon in his prime. He's more along the lines of the Malkovich, where he's interesting to look at, and you can't look away. Bruno Gans as well. Like I just love his look in it, and the clothing that they put on him, and just kind of his smirk on his face a lot of the times. But the way that Müller shoots him is in a kind of softer way.
Absolutely.
I find because you're supposed to root for him. You know that he's doing something bad, but you're supposed to root for him. And I don't know how you feel about his character and his motivations, but I'm rooting for him, and that helps with the way he's shot. Yeah, I guess how do you feel about the way the camera is kind of sympathizing with his character?
I like it. I'd have to rewatch it to understand how that's working completely. But I think the first scene you see him in, he's a bit more haughty, a bit more stuck up in a way. You see him at the beginning of this curve that sort of has a lot of factors in it, or at least two, his relationship with Hopper and his illness. I think he starts to go inside more and more. Like it's a cliche, I guess, but an interior performance where he's retreating inside himself so much throughout the film. And that this works so well with Hopper's very extroverted performance. And it's like Hopper is also having a hard time reading him, like the audience maybe is, and is trying to impress him or make him laugh or win his approval. There's sort of a childlike quality to Hopper's insecurities, I think, which is the other side of his sort of more sociopathic, manipulative, charismatic side of Ripley. And I think that the best films, Ripley films and performances have both of those.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, I feel like throughout the film, Gans sort of goes inside himself and then starts to come out again. And when he comes out again, it's a different, more manic kind of bizarro Gans. The final scene on the highway where he's driving being the most striking example of that. But also the second job, like he seems to be more and more willing to participate in these labors, maybe gets more and more almost enjoyment out of them. He seems to be learning maybe new things about himself in a way throughout the film. And that there's a mischievousness to his character and a glee, I guess, that you don't see at the beginning. Near the end that he portrays very well. Like they're getting into capers together, sort of.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even when the wife shows up at the end, it's kind of like it's already past the point of no return and they've just got to go for it in a way.
And I think those qualities are brought out by Ripley, whether, Zimmerman wanted them to or not. He does develop a closeness and a comfort with him. They also went through like something, at least for Zimmerman, traumatic because he wasn't expecting that job to go down that way on the train. For him, I guess he's like, well, Ripley's here to take care of me. Whether he has other motives or not, I can trust him for now. So it brings out the other sides of him. So
yeah, and it's worth mentioning, maybe especially later on in the film, that it's funny.
Yeah, it is funny.
You see the guy in the like body cast smoking in the back of an ambulance, and there are funny parts to the film, and funny parts especially, I think, to Hopper's performance. But
for me, when it gets to that scene, not to compare it to other directors, but it felt like it was kind of out of a David Lynch scene.
Absolutely.
Where it's something serious or fucked up's happening, and it's like in the background, there's characters who are just, as you said, like in a full body cast, smoking in the back, and you're like, I don't know what's happening, but this is also hilarious because it's supposed to be
Lynch, or like season 3 of Barry, which is essentially also Lynch.
I love that. You don't often see a funny side of Wenders.
No, maybe this is a good opportunity to discuss that, but it's how many good films does he make after this?
Well, Parasexus, yeah. I'm trying to get into more of his later stuff. I haven't finished that side of the filmography.
I could see you liking Gabriel Byrne, right? Is he in the end of, do I have that right? I saw this when I was like in high school or something.
I can't remember.
I think he's in the end of Violence. Is it the one that takes place around the LA Observatory? I wonder if that's a Ray homage in a way too. I certainly didn't get that at the time. But if it takes place around Griffin Park and the sort of observatory, whether that's meant to allude to Rebel Without a Cause. Yeah, like he seems to wear his influence on his sleeve a bit with the directors in this and with the soundtrack too. And even I don't know if Zimmerman was called Zimmerman in the original books, but the Dylan connection and then all the Kinks music.
No, he actually wasn't called Zimmerman. I read that recently. I think his name was like Cavani in the book.
Was this a Dylan homage then?
I think so. He never outright said it, but he specifically changed the name.
I think that there's a lot of this film that could appeal to a contemporary audience because there's been a lot repeated from it, I think. Like it was influenced by all these other things, but there's the Kinks song that's in Rushmore later. There's I don't know if this was Hopper's homage to Warhol, but on the pool table, the sort of selfie sesh that he does.
Oh, yeah.
I guess that's about the uncertainty of his identity and his imposter syndrome and where he fits in the world partially, which is also very Warholian. But like the sort of the tear on his chin and the tear running down his eye while he's like lying on the pool table is so interesting and well shot. It's one of maybe the tightest shots of a face in the film, as far as I can remember.
Yeah, he definitely not never, but he rarely does close-up shots. They, especially with vendors, that was their thing. They like to shoot with a wider lens. So when there is a close-up, it's for a specific reason.
Yeah.
As opposed to just being like, I'm just going to do close-ups because this person's talking.
Hopper's not crying enough. We've got to go in real tight if the audience is going to notice.
He's not sobbing, so we got to get that solo tear.
I would love to see an alternate take of that scene where he's just absolutely sobbing, taking Polaroids of himself and then lying down on the pool table.
That would be very Frank Booth of him. This is pretty Frank Booth, but
big stepping stone to that role, I think, this one.
I could go on about Hopper and his character choices throughout his career, but I'll save it.
I mentioned the soundtrack. I also really like the score to it, and I felt like there were a couple moments that fit into the contrasts and juxtapositions of, we were talking about extrovert, introvert, hot and cold colors. There were a couple small pieces in the score where the first one I noticed was, I think, that reminded me of Stereolab a bit, sort of maybe circa like Sound Dust or something, but it had that very kind of staccato, precise harpsichord with this flute on top of the sort of the two characters in a way. And later there was a violin or a viola over a piano this time, but very staccato as well. And I thought that those pieces fit in with the other elements of the film in a really good way.
I think it fits in with, like, again, the noir of it and the uncertainty of you never know what's kind of going to happen next without it being too over dramatic and being like, okay, this is how you should feel at this moment. It's sort of leading you without forcing your hand, which is like the perfect type of score. Sometimes the score does need to evoke emotion, but this is just kind of like matching the vibes of the scene.
Yeah, the film as a whole feels very kind of, the elements of the film at least feel harmonious. There's tension within that, I think, on purpose for thematic and plot reasons where things are brushing up against each other. But as far as the different elements of the film, the score, the soundtrack, the cinematography, the acting, the editing, nothing really sticks out in a bad way, I think. I think it's of one piece in a way that's very effective. And to the credit of everyone involved, that they're working well as a team, or that the final product is sort of this, the final piece is this thing that is one whole.
That's, a sign of a good director in a sense, because he's the leader of the whole team.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, credits to him, but everyone.
Maybe I should really try his later work more or watch more by him, but I haven't honestly found a lot that I love from him. This in Paris, Texas. I mean, I haven't seen anything from before this, but I really didn't like Wings of Desire for whatever reason. And the later stuff, there hasn't been much that has interested me, but I should maybe get more into it because this is such a great film.
It's weird because, I mean, I am a big fan of his work, but this one is very different. So I could see this being like the one for you and the other one's not, because the other ones are not, I don't know, there's, as much as I love them, there's something that's missing from this one. It's not, and that is missing from even like the Paris, Texas, and why these are the two big ones. Although Wings of Desire is big and Kings of the Road, Alice in the Cities is big, but they're not Paris, Texas, they're not The American Friend. I don't know if that's maybe because they're shot in color. I don't think so, but it's just something story-wise that melds better than the other ones, I think, as much as I love the other ones. That's for the eventual Vendors Month. I'd love to get into the last segment here, the end credits, because there's something that you mentioned that ties it into this. So the first question is, if someone comes up to you and is like, hey, Peter, I've never seen a film that Robby Müller's worked on. I'm kind of getting interested in his stuff, or I've heard about him. Would you recommend they start with The American Friend? If so, why? And if not, which of his films would you recommend as a starter point?
So with the qualification that I really don't know that much about him, and I think I've seen, I don't know, less than half a dozen of his films. I do think that this is, I would say that this seems to be maybe his breakout film in a way, and that I think it accomplishes a lot of the goals of good cinematography. So in that sense, yes, absolutely. And is a good and enjoyable and accessible, I would say, in my opinion, film.
Yeah.
Period. And is entertaining and doesn't have too much trom in it. So
yeah.
yeah, I would absolutely.
No, that's a good answer. Yeah. It's interesting with this question when we're talking about cinematographers, because you're dealing with, as much as he's worked with the same directors multiple times, it's still different directors, and you have to take that into account. So it's usually just a personal preference. But I would agree. I would say either this or Paris, Texas would be the great starting points. And if you like that visual style, then you can go from there and you can tackle the black and white.
Yeah, maybe some of his black and white work, I'd say. Maybe he did Coffee and Cigarettes, right? Too?
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe that.
Any Jarmusch for me. I'm a huge Jarmusch fan, so I'd recommend any of his films, but I think we agree on the first question. The second one is the double bill question. So if you're building a double bill, either for yourself, for someone else, what film are you pairing this with? Noting that sometimes you're making a double bill that to suit a certain, vibe that you're going for, or you're trying to pair it with something that's very similar or go opposites. So shoot me with any of the movies you'd pair this with.
You could almost do a festival of double bills with this.
Yeah.
I think where you do it with a Fuller, maybe Naked Kiss. You do it with, if I was doing it with a Ray, which Ray would I do it with? Maybe, there's so many of his films I love. Maybe Lusty Men.
Okay.
Because it's got that seemingly asymmetrical kind of male friendship element to it. Although I guess there's also a bit of that in Bigger Than Life and a lot of his films, Rebel. And then you could do it with a Ripley film. I like the Talented Mr. Ripley, the Matt Damon one, but Ripley's Game would sort of make sense with Malkovich because a lot of it, this one takes elements, I think, of a couple of Ripley books, and Ripley's Game is more just straight up Ripley's games. But you could do that. You could do it with another Wenders. You could do it with another neo-noir. This and The Long Goodbye wouldn't be the worst.
Yeah.
Also, I mentioned Christopher Doyle before. So, I think that this and Chungking Express would be a really great double bill. Maybe that's, if I'm only allowed to answer one, then maybe that's what I'd settle on. I'd go American Friend and Chungking Express. They've both got the sort of greens and reds on screen. They're both romantic in a way, shot at night. They've got these great American pop songs on the soundtrack, narrative momentum. Yeah, you don't want something too long or kind of ponderous in a double bill, I don't think, on either film. So yeah, I'll choose that, I guess.
What I came up with were two different. I went with two French noirs. Okay. I don't know why. Those are the two that came up in my mind. So the first was the Melville, The Red Circle.
I haven't seen that one.
It's much quieter. And Melville stuff can be quiet, but this one's particularly quiet without it feeling like you don't know what's happening. It needs to be quiet because they're conducting a heist. So it makes sense. But it's the tension and the relationships between the characters that I think mirror this as well. So it's just those male relationships. And if you want to go that way, the other one I thought of, and it just was randomly, was Godard's Alphaville.
Okay, interesting.
Because you kind of got that character who you're not really sure what his deal is. And it's the same with Ripley, where you're not totally sure what his deal is. Even if you have seen, what I love about the Hopper performance, not to keep harping on it, is because especially if you have seen the other Ripleys, you kind of know what Ripley is about. But the way he plays it, you don't really know what he's about.
So if we could rewrite the tagline for the poster, would it just be, what's his deal? Question mark?
Yeah. Yeah. What's up with this guy? Those would be the ones, just if you want to go with the crime noir route. But I love the Chungking Express because, like you said, what I love about that double bill would be the music also. And just having The American Friend at times, yes, can be funny, but it's not fun per se. It's not a fun movie. Chungking Express is a bit more fun, but it's not also just like a straight up comedy. there's the melding of genres for both.
Dennis Hopper's got that fun element to him, I think, though, in this film, where he's going to live his life and do what he wants. And I think sometimes he doesn't understand why people won't participate in his capers with him and stuff. And it almost reminds me of Nicolas Cage in Face Off, where he's like, yeah, I shot your son, but it wasn't on purpose. And like, why are you taking this so seriously? Like, I could see Ripley in this almost saying the same thing or like, he's like, yeah, I was upset because you wouldn't shake my hand or whatever. That's a bit of an incoherent thought, sorry. But I do think that there's quite a fun element to Hopper's performance.
There is, and there is a part that I did want, and I forgot to mention. It's just like that classic Dennis Hopper laugh, where he has that weird like chuckle that he does, and he'll say something serious like, "Oh well, you didn't shake my hand and you insulted me," and you're like, "Oh, is this guy gonna snap?" But then he laughs, and you're like, "Okay, I guess he's not that mad at it."
And then Bruno Gantz's uneasy laugh and the way his eyes move around is so good. Yeah, they're such a great. It is almost like a buddy comedy in some ways. The performances, such a great pair.
I think so. And I think they did a good job. And it's great that they managed to resolve whatever differences they had over drinks. But I think that's The American Friend. I think we touched upon the stuff that needs to be. As with all films, we can talk about it
ad nauseum.
You just got to watch it. Just watch it. You got
to watch it.
I hope that you've seen it if you made it this far. And if not, definitely go watch it. And if you have seen it, hopefully you rewatch it because, as we've mentioned, it's a very rewatchable film. Thank you so much, Peter, for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on. It's been a blast.
Seeing Faces in Movies is an official podcast of the Royal Film Club. It's hosted and edited by Felicia and René, intro music by Lamar Walker, and additional help from Dara McGraw. If you like what you heard, let us know at seeingfacesinmovies.com or send us an email at seeingfacesinmovies@gmail.com. And while you're at it, please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to your podcast. And stay tuned for our next episode on Paris, Texas.